Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I have with us the one, the only, the returning Stephanie Trunk. Stephanie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi all. I'm Stephanie Trunk. I'm a partner at Arent Fox Schiff outside of Washington, D.C. And I specialize focus my practice on reimbursement issues for primarily drugs, but a little bit of device as well, but all life sciences.
And Stephanie, the reason I have invited Stephanie over is because the last time she came on, we talked about the IRA, not the financial instrument and not the group out of Ireland, but the third IRA, if you will. And it was very well received, and I will make sure I put a link in there to talk about that again for those people who want to come back to it. But Stephanie, we decided that what we're going to do is we're going to have like a reimbursement 101 so that people know where to start. So we're going to let you guide this conversation, Stephanie. Over to you.
Sure. And we're going to do reimbursement 101 today about drugs. Maybe another time we'll do device, but today we'll talk, which is even more confusing because there's so many different types of devices. But drugs, if you're a new manufacturer, you're new to the pharmaceutical space and you're bringing a drug to market, you might think getting through all of the FDA hurdles and getting your approval is getting you all the way there. But I always like to take a step back and say, well, that's all fine and good. You might have the best drug in the world. It might be complete blockbuster, but if it's not being paid and it's not being covered, then you've got a real problem. And I think we may have seen some of that with some of the newer kind of Alzheimer's products, with Aduhelm being subject to a national coverage determination and the like, that it really has kind of thwarted some sales for that product. So with that, we thought we'd kind of take a step back and talk about coverage of drugs or prescription drugs really in the United States. And I think if you're bringing a drug to market, you have to think about what your therapy is and who is going to be the primary utilizer of your therapy. Because if you're talking about something that is pediatric indicated versus something that is an Alzheimer's product that might skew to an older population, you're talking about a different base of potential patients. Essentially, we have two very large entitlement programs in the United States, as we're all aware. The two M's of CMS, as we've said before, they are Medicare and Medicaid. Medicaid is a program that is funded jointly by the federal government and the state governments. And every state has a Medicaid program. And recently, Puerto Rico also has a more traditional Medicaid program. And the original aim of Medicaid was on families with small children. So it's definitely more of what I would call, it started at least as a pediatric kind of focus on pediatric population for lower income families. So that kind of was its start. It covered, pregnant women, it covered families, but it didn't cover childless adults. That was extended under the Affordable Care Act, where now most states also will cover childless adults with a certain income threshold. If you have a drug that is going to be primarily utilized in the Medicaid population or substantially utilized in the Medicaid population, and as a manufacturer, you want your product covered, you have to participate in something known as the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program. This is a program that requires manufacturers to essentially pay to the states back-end rebates on utilization of those products by Medicaid beneficiaries in their states. It can get a little complicated. It has complex calculations and there's a complex share between the federal and state government. But the good thing about having a product that has a lot of Medicaid utilization, especially if you're an existing manufacturer that's already in the program, is that you're going to have automatic coverage of your new product under the states. Can also get a little bit more nuanced because states can put subject products to prior authorization and the like, but they can't just not cover it to the extent you're in the rebate program.
Quick question for you. Just so I understand the difference here, because this is some of those things that insurance companies get into. Uh-huh. Is this a question, if someone comes in and says, what will my drug cost? is that something a lawyer will answer? Is that something a consultant will answer? Or is that something an accountant will answer when they come to you?
I think that is a great question. And this kind of ties into like the bigger conversation we've been having in general. You'll hear, you know, probably heard it last night at the State of the Union, right? Drug costs are too high, prices are too high, but what does that really mean? And if you're talking about cost, and I always say like cost to whom? Cost to whom? Because you have a sale. The way that our chain works, our pharmaceutical chain works, is that there's a sale from a manufacturer, usually to a wholesaler, maybe directly to like a pharmacy or a hospital at a certain price point. And usually the start of that price is some sort of list price. We might call it wholesale acquisition costs. Some manufacturers don't really call it that. They might call it a list price. And sometimes it's discounted, where it's contractually discounted, and that's what they purchase at. And then there's the back end. There's reimbursement. Maybe that's, and that's more, I think, of what we think about when we're talking about consumers and we're talking about individuals. What will I pay for my drug? And that is derivative of what coverage you have for drugs, whether you, and for a lot of us in the United States, we don't have Medicaid. We tend to have employer group coverage. And it depends on what kind of employer group coverage I have, how my benefit is designed, whether my product is considered medical versus pharmacy. Do I take it myself? Is it self-administered? Is it something that is injected by a physician? All the coverage can vary, and a lot is derivative of what my share of whatever the set reimbursement from my employer or insurance is. So it can be a co-insurance. It could be 20% of the total cost to my plan, and that's the cost to my plan. And it can be, or it could be a flat dollar copay, where it might be a preferred item on my formulary and I'm only paying $20 or what have you. It can also get muddied up, I think, in whether it's a cash pay product, right? And in certain instances, we've seen a lot, that now paying out of pocket sometimes is cheaper than using our insurance. And I think that is a kind of phenomenon that we've seen kind of come over time with high deductible health plans, where you might not even have reimbursable coverage until you hit your out-of-pocket max, which might be $2,000 a year or what have you. And so you're using like a GoodRx, where you're tapping into a discounted amount that they've negotiated for your price. Or perhaps we're using Mark Cuban's pharmacy, where he's got like the limited set of kind of a fixed price cost up approach for, which are primarily at this time kind of lower cost generics. So it really depends on when you're thinking about price to whom. And another kind of element that I think gets muddied up into the conversation, and of course we've seen this recently in the news or with the FTC, is back-end rebates that PBMs or plans might be receiving from manufacturers, but retaining, where patients really aren't getting the benefit of those negotiated additional discounts that are paid as retrospective rebates. So it's a very complicated, it seems like a simple question, right? What's the price? But it gets very complicated in the pharmaceutical space.
Very, very cool. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to throw you off your rhythm there, but
no, not at all.
So far we have a question of who's the audience, and you've been answering that by saying you've got the Medicaid, which started off initially as something for families, if you will, with low-income families with kids, which is now under the Affordable Care Act included families in general. And you were then continuing, and I want to
yeah. So we kind of started with Medicaid, and the other large entitlement program we have in the United States, we all know, is Medicare, which again, at the State of the Union, we heard no one was going to touch Medicare. So I guess that's good news. And Medicare, actually, we think of it as for the 65 and older. And I would say that's primarily, it's retired adults in the United States that qualify for Medicare, but also disabled. If you can have Medicare coverage due to disability and be younger than 65. And there are other reasons as well, such as having kidney disease, but or some other reasons. But we think of it as primarily 65 and older. So if you're bringing a drug to market, like an Aduhelm, Alzheimer's product, or something that skews to the older population, that becomes a lot of your focus because you need Medicare coverage. And Medicare also becomes kind of the leader in coverage determinations sometimes related to products where, and I think we've seen this with the Alzheimer's products, where they're kind of a thought leader scientifically, what is an effective product, what population it belongs in. And then we'll see pharmacy and therapeutics committees at PBMs, at health plans, kind of follow Medicare's lead, if you will. So it's a very important program to ensure that you're having coverage under as you're bringing a product to market. It can make or break a drug launch, I think, depending on the drug.
So, question here, because you mentioned that they're a leader, and it's been in the news recently, which I'm sure you follow more than even I do. But there was a decision recently whether certain fast track drugs will be paid for in the same way. And I think it was Medicare who came out and said we're going to look at reimbursement issues there. And again, I'm not trying to complicate things. I'm trying to add some current references to the points you're making. My question to you is, what makes Medicare qualified to answer that question when, say, for example, the FDA is already doing addressing this question?
Sure, and you're hitting on to like another debate that we're having by and large is like, who is the authority on whether a product is really effective and should be covered, right? Because FDA is making these determinations that a product is safe and effective. That's its focus. And a lot of times you'll see CMS defer to FDA on various issues. Like, what type of drug is it? What category does it belong in? It'll say, well, the FDA told us that's a generic because it's an ANDA, or they told it's a brand because it's an NDA. But CMS also currently makes its own. On the B side, it's actually the agency itself with some of its advisors and contractors that make these coverage determinations for products within the confines of its statutes. And they certainly have expertise. There are scientists, there are economists that look at the cost effectiveness. They've got their kind of own team of experts that reviews the FDA data and other literature and makes their own determinations of when a product should be covered. We by and large see that on the Part B side of the house, which are a lot of the physician administered products in national coverage determinations or local coverage determinations if we're talking about the contractors. On the D side, when we're talking about self-administered products, we see that being made by private contractors to CMS through their own pharmacy and therapeutics committees, which again, there are criteria that they have to meet under the Medicare Part D regulations, but they're by and large what you would think of made up of consultants for PBMs and plans that are doctors and pharmacists, and to a lesser extent, they're looking at kind of cost effectiveness, ICER data, and that type of thing, secondary to effectiveness. So you do have kind of this, you've got this kind of weird interplay between the two agencies where you've got some, reliance on FDA, you're the expert, and then some of we're going to do our own work because we're running Medicare. So it's kind of a very interesting dynamic. It's played out very recently with, as you kind of alluded to, fast-tracked products or those that get breakthrough designation through FDA, and whether there was going to be like automatic coverage of those products. And we're not there yet. Every once in a while, we will see kind of Congress even push a bill that would allow or would require automatic coverage of products that have breakthrough status by Medicare. At least for a certain period of time. And those have not come to, they've never become law. So, but you'll hear that discussion kind of, it's kind of like a revolving door. You'll hear that discussion periodically because a lot of times, and this is a misnomer, someone says, oh, well, we have breakthrough status, we're going to be covered. And it's not a one-to-one. You still got to be engaging with CMS. And that can be a real blunder. If you're bringing a product to market and just saying, oh, we're covered because we've got breakthrough status.
So what you're raising is a very interesting question to me, mostly because I feel like when again, I'm coming from the FDA perspective, right? Because reimbursement is not my thing. But when you're looking at the FDA thing, I feel like you're giving them all the information that is about safety, about efficacy, so that the FDA can make an informed decision about whether to approve the product or not. You'll end up writing your new drug applications in a way that say, here's why we think it should be approved, but you as the FDA get to make the decision. My question for you is, when you're dealing with CMS, in this specific case, we're talking about Medicare, do they have more data, or do they have the same data on which they're making these additional determinations? Because I'm visualizing pharmacoeconomic data for sure, but do they look at the efficacy data all over again and the safety data? Is it like almost a double check of the FDA?
It's a bit of it's a little bit of deference to the FDA and a little bit of a double check of the FDA, I would say, especially when they're talking about efficacy or what population CMS thinks it's going to be cost effective for. And I think we see this more, and we've seen it. I go back to my Alzheimer's examples because that's where we've seen it a lot recently, because it's very rare for a drug to come out. It's a Medicare Part B drug. It's physician administered. Usually the criteria is that it's medically necessary and provided incident to a physician service, right? Something that's administered in the office. It might be an IV, it might be an injection. And we saw a CMS promulgate a national coverage determination for these products that really limits when they're going to cover it to individuals that are still enrolled in like a post FDA mandated trial. So a very limited coverage, very limited population, which is very rare. Will we see more of it? Maybe. We saw that CMS consider that for CAR Ts and then ultimately drop the NCD. So CAR Ts are covered more broadly than we see kind of the newer Alzheimer's products being covered. So it may be a trend, it may not, who knows? But also, I mean, I think some of that goes along with how quickly FDA on an accelerated basis approve those products.
Now, part of that question, you talked about deference there. Does FDA can, as you pointed out, say, we'll approve this as part of speeding through the process, but you'll do studies afterwards. Mm-hmm. Can Medicare come out and say, we will conditionally approve this, but you need to do additional studies? Or is that only what the FDA can do?
I don't think they can really mandate additional studies in the same way as FDA, because FDA, of course, can pool a product if you didn't follow through with the conditions on the approval. CMS doesn't have that ability, but they certainly will revisit coverage criteria over time because of additional information. So it may be to your benefit as a manufacturer to do additional studies, or perhaps to highlight cost effectiveness or cost to CMS over time to get broader coverage.
Awesome, thank you. Didn't mean to slow you down again. So we're now back to talking about, we were talking about Medicaid. We talked about Medicaid first. We talked about Medicare here. You made references to two things, which were local coverage decisions and national coverage decisions. Do you want to talk about that a little bit further before we go to the next piece?
Sure. And I think this is a big distinction to think of when you're bringing a product to market. Again, is how is it administered? Do I take it at home by myself, or do I need to go to a doctor's office, a home infusion pharmacy, a facility to have it administered essentially to me, because it puts you in a different place. It either puts you under B, Medicare Part B, that part of the benefit, or it puts you under D. And your focus, your audience for coverage decisions is different. B side, as I mentioned, you can get something known as a national coverage determination, or you can get a local coverage determination. The way that Part B is administered is it's a benefit that is administered by the agency itself through the help of subcontractors known as Medicare Administrative Contractors, MACs, that work in various regions, and they literally process claims. So they are able to make their own determinations of coverage, which is essentially what is the criteria we're going to follow that we think indicates medical necessity. That's kind of a way to think of it. Or CMS can promulgate something known as a national coverage determination, which would apply to all the MACs. So you have kind of a choice of audience, or the default of coverage is just that your doctor thinks it's medically necessary, which is the default for claims processing. By and large, if you have a physician administered product, it's going to be, that meets the Medicare Part B definition and criteria, it's going to be covered. This imposing coverage criteria in an NCD or LCD is kind of, as we've been talking, more of a unique thing for some of the more expensive, complicated therapies that have been coming to market of recently. With Part D, your audience is different. It's actually almost more like commercial in that it's run by private plans. It's run by the big PBMs that, they all have their own Part D plans or their subcontractors to Part B plans. So we have SilverScript out there, which is a Caremark company that runs a bunch of Part D plans. And your audience is in a similar vein, those P&T committees and those players, and you're working the same kind of coverage process that you would if you were trying to get something approved and added to a commercial plan formulary. So different players, different audience, different rules. Under Part D, they are allowed to have formularies. They don't have to, but all Part D plans really do. And they're required to cover 2 separate drugs per therapeutic class outside of what are known as the protected classes. So you're kind of working within that rubric where your drug may be covered. You might be the second novel therapy in a class and you're going to automatically get coverage. But if you're not, you're one of many, you're probably going to need to come to the table with some sort of formulary rebate to help enhance the offer to get coverage under those Medicare Part D plans. That's a very, very similar process to the commercial process.
I have 2 questions about that. The first one is I kind of lost you a little bit on that one. And what I mean by that is I'm trying to understand what you mean. What I think you said, I'm going to repeat it and you can tell me, no, that's not what I was saying at all. But I think what you said was if there is a certain drug class, and even as a pharmacist, I still struggle with what do you mean by the word class here.
Yes.
But let's assume there's a certain drug class. You will allow for essentially 3 drugs in that drug class to be reimbursed. Is that what you said, or did I misunderstand what you said?
2 separate drugs.
Oh, just 2 separate drugs. Yeah. I thought there's a primary and then 2 secondaries.
Yeah.
Just
2.
one. Okay.
Yeah.
And so 2 separate drugs. Is there a difference in reimbursement for those, or is it the same rate of reimbursement?
There can be, yes.
Oh.
All of it is privately negotiated. The reimbursement is actually privately negotiated between plans or their PBMs and the actual pharmacies that are dispensing products. And it's usually some sort of formula that looks a lot like a commercial formula. And believe it or not, those formulas still start with AWP, or average wholesale price, which of course is another acronym and it's another kind of list price or sticker price. Sometimes we'll think of it as like the MSRP of a car. And it becomes the starting point, which it's usually discounted, and then there's a dispense fee. It can also, but they all vary.
Sure. Yeah, I don't even go down the acronyms because there are so many of them.
Many.
But I kind of want to explore this a little bit, only because I have never heard of what you just mentioned, and I feel like I've been around reimbursement enough to be dangerous, and that's very true. Dangerous is a good place for my knowledge base here, which is why I never talk about it, just to be clear to anyone listening. But what I'm hearing you say is there'll be 2 drugs. There may be others, but you then need to discount them significantly or provide rebates or the like significantly to just be on the formulary. Is that what you're saying?
You can, yeah, depending on what your drug, like if you're bringing a run-of-the-mill generic, right, to market, that's less of usually the issue because generics tend to get added to formularies very quickly. They're cheaper, more cost-effective, and viewed more as commodities. But if you're bringing a branded alternative to a class of products, you are likely going to have to negotiate to offer a rebate in order to get formulary coverage. Absolutely.
So let me do an example of this from, now I'm dating myself, but a few, almost over a decade ago at this point, one of the highest selling drugs of all time was Lipitor. Mm-hmm. Lipitor was sold like water. I think if I remember correctly, it was a big deal then. They made like $4 billion a year on that drug. And then while Lipitor was still a brand, I think Mevacor and another one went generic, which was a big deal because it was in the statin class.
Yes.
And those drugs started getting coverage. And then came the patent cliff, and Lipitor went generic. Now, my question for you is, using the rubric you just gave, would people say, would I, as a commercial provider, commercial payer, say, I already have, I'm making up the drugs because Mevacor was one, but drug 2, whatever it was. I know it wasn't Crestor, so I'm trying to stay away from that one. But Mevacor and drug 2 were already on the formulary. We aren't going to do anything with Lipitor because we don't have to. Or do they go, everyone's on Lipitor. Atorvastatin is, let's take lovastatin and mevastatin. So lovastatin and mevastatin were on generic. They were already on covered. Atorvastatin comes on. Do they have to cover it? That's the question I'm asking.
Not under the D rhetoric, if you consider the statin the class, right? Because it's 2 per class. They already had 2, right? Yeah.
So commercial success has no bearing.
Yeah. And it's Lipitor is actually a really interesting example because, there was a lot of effort spent on negotiating rebates to get formulary position and locking it in for a long period of time, even after knowing that the generic was going to come on market, locking it into a longer term and combining it with other products that, and offering rebates kind of in a bundle to try to hold on to that formulary positioning. And it's that type of kind of smart analysis and thought that can extend coverage of your product even after there's been generics. So it's a really good example of thinking ahead to ensure that you're going to have coverage on formularies.
And now I'm going to take a step back just to sort of reconcile some of the questions and issues you've raised. You said that as a drug company, you might go down the B route or the D route. Yeah. I'm comparing this to going down the new drug application route or the generic drug application route. So an NDA or an ANDA. And in my head, I go, if I have a client who has a choice between those two, pick ANDA 100% of the time because it's faster, cheaper to get through it. However, does that apply in the reimbursement world? Can you do that?
Not. You can't really pick B versus D. B versus D is driven on really administration. Or there are other products that can be covered under D or B, just because it kind of predated D, if you will, like immunosuppressants or a class of drugs that are covered under B just because there was coverage for them prior to having D, even though we take them on our own, just like we would our Lipitor or what have you. But it really, it's going to be driven as to your, going back to FDA, what the product is approved for, the route of administration. If it's a tablet or a capsule that we're taking self-administering to ourselves on our own, it's going to be a D product.
So, which is really interesting to me because no one in all the times I've done this with companies, no one raises the question of reimbursement because you might change how you're going to position your drug because you might say, I want this to be self-administered, example, an insulin, as opposed to an IV drug that you're going to have to go, like a anti-rheumatoid arthritis drug, I'm blanking on some of them, that you're going to walk into a doctor's office and they're going to give it to you.
Right.
First of all, are you ever called into conversations that early to ask which direction should we be positioning our drug? And I've just not been privy to those conversations. I'm
really not. And that's you raise a really good point because perhaps maybe not even necessarily me, but business individuals within companies or those that are thinking about economics or positioning a product in the market, if there's an ability at the FDA level to position, and I'm thinking like subcutaneous injectables, right? Those are really a good example where sometimes they'll end up with an FDA label that says they have to be physician administered. Would it be better And would it be easier to position and roll out your product if it really was a self-injected product? And I think those conversations I don't usually see had. And a lot of times I find that the science and like the FDA approvals kind of happen in a vacuum. And then the rest of the commercial organization isn't really brought into the mix until there's like a PDUFA date. And then they're like, okay, bring in the sales, bring in the accountants. Yeah, I think that's just kind of the nature a little bit of how scientific and how specific the approval process is. But it would be, I think, worthwhile for manufacturers to be having more, at least at a high level, global conversations about products as they're being developed.
So, I mean, I'm thinking, obviously, insulin's a good example, but insulin's kind of almost determined, like you kind of have to do it on your own. But an example I'm thinking of is sub-Q heparin, which is used all the time by patients who might be on short-term therapy. But I wonder if anyone's ever explored going back all the way and saying, we're going to do a sub-Q heparin for self-injection so that we can convert over to a warfarin in the future. Right. And I've never seen that conversation had. Mostly, I expect at this point, because it's too late to have the conversation because you've got factor 10As at this point. But ignoring that part of it, is there, if you had a choice and if you could go back and help companies make that determination, would you tell them to do Part D over Part B? Is the process easier or not?
It's a great question. I think the D process is more complicated. You're dealing with many more players, right? You're dealing with this. It's kind of like I said, it emulates commercial. So you're dealing with at least 3 big PBMs, a lot of different health plans. It's just a lot of players, a lot of different reimbursement formulas, a lot of different demands. It's not uniform. B is it can be very uniform, right? If you have a separately paid product, we have a prescribed reimbursement formula, ASP, average sales price. But on the B side, we still have more co-insurance, right? It's unlimited 20% co-insurance across the board, no cap. Which of course now with D, we're going to get a better cap. We're getting rid of the weirdo coverage gap. So you've got, perhaps you could have more uptick from patients themselves on the D side because there's less barriers to their, going back to what do you mean by price? And are you talking about what I pay? There's still a lot of cost sharing on the B side. And depending on the cost of your product and what you think your price point is going to be, that could be kind of detrimental.
So what I hear you saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, what I hear you saying is even if you have the choice between a B and a D, you want to try to pick B if you can, only because your life is a lot simpler. Interesting. So I'm going through my head and I picked warfarin a few seconds ago, but now I'm thinking Ozempic and the like. If they could have had their druthers and they have planned this in a different way, they could have looked at positioning it as a B product. Would be incredibly inconvenient for most patients, but the result of it would have been an easier coverage process.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, interesting at this point. Any other parting words before we call this piece a close or a wrap, if you will?
I don't think so, but I tell you, every time we have these conversations, I feel like we barely scratched the surface. You are right. It's complicated.
Well, I thank you for coming on, Stephanie. Before you go, how can people reach you?
Sure. So again, I am partner at Aaron Fox Schiff. My email is stephanie.trunk@AarentFox or at afslaw.com or at aaronfox.com. And we do blog frequently. Our blog is called Healthcare Council Blog. We write frequently on life sciences and prescription drug issues and just broader healthcare issues from some of my colleagues. If you Google it, you can find it. You can subscribe and get it delivered to your mailbox.
Awesome. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on.
Sure. Good to see you.